Pick up any history book about the ancient world, and you'll see the word Persia everywhere. The Persian Empire, the Persian Wars, Persian kings, Persian culture. It's one of the most famous names in human history, right up there with Rome and Egypt. But here's the thing that probably kept you up one night if you ever thought about it. Open a modern map and Persia is nowhere to be found. Instead, there's Iran. Same place, same mountains, same deserts, but a completely different name. So what happened? When did Persia become Iran? Was it a revolution, a conquest, some political decree? And why does almost nobody know the real story? If you think the answer is simple, like it just changed in 1935 when the government made it official, you're technically right. But you're also missing about 3,000 years of context that makes that moment make sense. Because here's what they don't tell you in school. The people who lived in Persia never actually called their land Persia. That was a foreign name, a Greek name, given to them by outsiders who only saw one small part of a vast civilization. The Iranians themselves, for millennia, had a different word for their homeland. And the story of how these two names coexisted, competed, and eventually collided is way more fascinating than any textbook will admit. Tonight, we're going back to the very beginning, before the name change in 1935, before the Shahs and the Safavids, before the Arabs and the Mongols, before even Cyrus the Great built the empire that made Persia famous. We're going all the way back to the ancient peoples who first settled the Iranian plateau and asked themselves, who are we? Where do we come from? And what should we call this place? The answers they came up with would echo through thousands of years of empires, invasions, and transformations. And somehow, despite everything, that ancient identity survived. Most people have never heard this full story. They know Persia was powerful. They know Iran exists today. But the journey between those two names, the empires that rose and fell, the identities that were claimed and reclaimed, the way a single people managed to stay themselves through Greek conquest, Arab invasion, Mongol devastation, and everything else history could throw at them, that story almost never gets told. So if you enjoy falling asleep to these kinds of deep historical journeys, you might also like our book exploring other forgotten chapters of the ancient world. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. And if you're just here to drift off while learning something incredible, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. It's always wild seeing Tokyo at sunrise and Toronto at midnight all in the same comment section. Now, settle in, get comfortable, because we're about to trace one name, one identity, one people, across 3,000 years of history. And by the end, you'll never think about Persia or Iran the same way again. Before we can understand how Persia became Iran, we need to understand the place itself, the Iranian plateau. If you've never really thought about the geography, you're missing half the story. Because this wasn't just some random patch of land where empires happened to rise. This was one of the most challenging and strategically crucial landscapes in the ancient world. A vast elevated region roughly the size of Western Europe, ringed by some of the most formidable mountain ranges on Earth. To the north, the Alborz Mountains, and beyond them, the Caspian Sea. To the west, the Zagros Mountains, running like a spine down toward the Persian Gulf. To the east, mountain ranges that eventually blend into the Hindu Kush and the highlands of Central Asia. And in between, deserts, salt flats, but also fertile valleys, underground water channels called qanats that made agriculture possible in seemingly impossible places, and highland plateaus perfect for pastoralism. This geography did something crucial. It created natural boundaries that protected the people inside while also forcing them to become incredibly adaptive. You couldn't just rely on one survival strategy here. Coastal communities lived differently than mountain dwellers. Desert peoples developed entirely different skills than valley farmers. The Iranian plateau didn't produce one unified culture. It produced a patchwork of interconnected peoples who learned to thrive in radically different environments while maintaining trade and cultural ties across vast distances. and people had been living here for a very long time, long before anyone had heard of Persia, long before the Medes or the Persians arrived. The archaeological record shows sophisticated civilizations emerging on the plateau as early as 3000 BCE, maybe earlier. In the southwest, near modern Khuzestan, the Elamites built one of the world's first urban civilizations centered on the city of Susa. They had writing, monumental architecture, complex trade networks reaching into Mesopotamia and beyond. They weren't Persians. They weren't even speaking an Iranian language. They were their own distinct people with their own culture, and they would remain a major power in the region for over 2,000 years. Further south, in what's now Kerman province, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of the Jiroft civilization, dated to around 2500 BCE. Elaborate carved vessels, evidence of metalworking, indicators of a society wealthy enough to support specialist artisans. We don't know what they called themselves. Their writing system, if they had one, hasn't been deciphered. But they were here, thriving, trading, building. The point is, the Iranian plateau was never empty, never waiting for some great people to arrive and civilize it. It was already civilized, already complex, already ancient when the next chapter began. That next chapter came sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE, maybe earlier. Groups of people speaking Iranian languages, part of the broader Indo-European family, began migrating onto the plateau from the north and northeast. Not as a single wave of conquest, but gradually, over centuries. Small groups of pastoralists moving with their herds, finding good grazing land, settling, intermarrying with existing populations. These Iranian-speaking peoples would eventually differentiate into distinct groups. The Medes in the northwest, the Persians in the southwest, the Parthians in the northeast, many others whose names have been lost. But they shared something crucial, a common linguistic heritage, and a common name for the land they were claiming as home. That name was something like Iranian, the land of the Aryans. In Old Persian it was Iranian. In Middle Persian it became Iran, eventually Iran. The term Aryan, in this original context, had nothing to do with race theories or the horrific misappropriations of the 20th century. It was simply what these Iranian-speaking peoples called themselves. It meant noble or free, and it distinguished them as linguistic and cultural group. This is the crucial thing to understand. From the very beginning, the people living on this plateau had an insider name for their homeland. Variations of Iran, land of the Aryans. They used this name in their inscriptions, their poetry, their royal proclamations. It was their identity, their claim to belonging. But the outside world, particularly the Greeks, who would later write the histories that shaped Western memory, they didn't call it Iran. They focused on one specific Iranian group, the Persians, who built the most famous empire, and they called the whole region Persia, after the province of Pers in the southwest. Two names for one place, the insider name and the outside name, and for the next 3,000 years these two identities would coexist, compete, and tell very different stories about the same civilization. Also, it seemed. The Medes were organized in tribes, each with its own chief, its own territory, its own interests. They bred horses in the highland valleys. They controlled critical trade routes between Mesopotamia and Central Asia. The Assyrians knew about them, extracted tribute from them, occasionally launched punitive expeditions to remind them who held real power, but they were fragmented. No single Median leader could challenge Assyria because there was no single Median state, just a collection of tribes who sometimes cooperated and sometimes fought each other. Then, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, writing a century and a half later, something changed. A man named Deioces convinced the Median tribes to unite under his leadership. He built a great capital city called Ecbatana, modern Hamadan, with 7 concentric walls, each painted a different color. The innermost walls were plated with silver and gold, gleaming in the highland sun like something from mythology. Deioces established himself as king and created the first unified Median state. Except we don't actually know if any of that is true. Here's the problem with the Medes. They left almost nothing behind. No extensive written records. No great libraries like the Assyrians. No monumental inscriptions proclaiming their deeds in their own words. Almost everything we know about them comes from outside sources. Herodotus writing long after their empire had fallen. Assyrian records that mention them only as tribute-paying subjects or occasional threats. Later Persian inscriptions that acknowledge the Medes as predecessors, but don't elaborate on the details. Modern archaeology has found some evidence of Median settlement at Hamadan, but nothing like the spectacular seven-walled city Herodotus described. There are fortifications, administrative buildings, evidence of a significant settlement. But was it really a capital in the sense we understand? A centralized administrative hub controlling a vast empire? Or was it just one important center among many, the seat of a particularly successful tribal confederation? Scholars are still arguing about this. Some think the Median Empire was indeed a true centralized state, a direct precursor to the Persian Empire that would follow. Others suggest it was more like a loose confederation of tribes who cooperated for military purposes but never really unified politically. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, shifting over time as different leaders with different capabilities rose and fell. What we do know for certain is what happened around 612 BCE, because that event was so momentous, so world-shattering, that everybody wrote about it. The Medes, under a king named Cyaxares, allied with Babylon, another power that had grown tired of Assyrian domination. Together they laid siege to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, the city that had seemed invincible, the heart of an empire that had terrorized the Near East for generations. According to multiple sources, the siege lasted only 3 months. Then the walls were breached. The city fell. The Assyrian king died in the flames of his palace. The greatest military power in the world collapsed so completely that within a generation people could barely remember how terrifying it had once been. The Medes didn't do this alone. Babylon played an equal or even larger role. But they were there. They were crucial. And after the victory, they claimed a substantial portion of the former Assyrian territories. Suddenly these highland tribes controlled an empire stretching from eastern Anatolia through the Zagros Mountains and beyond. They were a major power, a force that neighboring kingdoms had to respect and fear. What did the Medes call their realm? We don't have their records, but linguistic evidence and later Persian sources suggest they used variations of that same ancient name, the land of the Aryans. Their identity was rooted in the same linguistic and cultural heritage as the other Iranian peoples scattered across the plateau. They weren't Persians, not yet, but they were speaking a closely related language, worshipping similar gods, organizing their society according to similar principles. The Greeks, just beginning to encounter these Eastern powers, barely distinguished between them. Medes and Persians were all just Eastern barbarians to early Greek writers. Some Greek sources use the terms almost interchangeably. Others show awareness that the Medes came first, that they were the earlier dominant group. But the distinctions were fuzzy. These were all people from that vast mysterious region beyond the eastern horizons of the Greek world. The Median Empire, however defined, lasted perhaps 70 years as a major power. Maybe less. This is where the source problems get really frustrating. We don't know exactly how their administration worked. We don't know much about their culture, their literature, their daily life. We can infer some things from what came after, from Persian practices that probably had Median roots. The use of the old Elamite language for administrative purposes, certain styles of court ceremony. The organization of the empire into provinces called satrapies, though we're not certain the Medes used that exact system. What we do know is that the Medes had vassals, smaller kingdoms and tribal groups that acknowledged Median overlordship while maintaining their own local leadership. And one of those vassal groups lived in the southwestern part of the plateau, in a region called Persia. The Greeks would later call it Persis. We know it as Fars province. Those vassals called themselves Persians, and they were about to change everything. Because empires built on tribal confederations are inherently unstable. They depend on the personal authority of successful military leaders. When a strong king dies and a weaker one takes his place, vassals start calculating, start wondering whether their own ambitions might be achievable, start thinking that maybe the time has come to stop paying tribute and start collecting it instead. Around 550 BCE, a Persian king named Cyrus decided he was done being anybody's vassal, and the world would never be the same again. Cyrus was the king of Anshan, a Persian territory in what's now Fars province. He ruled as a vassal of the Median king Astyages, his grandfather according to some traditions. The arrangement should have been stable. The Persians paid tribute, the Medes provided protection, and left them mostly alone. Everyone benefited, but something went wrong. Maybe Astyages demanded too much. Maybe Cyrus was just unusually ambitious. Maybe, as Herodotus claims, there were prophecies and dreams and palace intrigue involving an attempted infanticide. We don't know what actually triggered the conflict. What we do know is that around 553 BCE, Cyrus revolted. He refused to send tribute. He started gathering support among other Persian tribes and discontented Median nobles. Astyages responded by sending an army to crush the rebellion, except the army defected, or large portions of it did. The sources disagree on the details, but the outcome is clear. Within just a few years, by 550 BCE, Cyrus had defeated Astyages, captured the Median capital at Ecbatana, and declared himself ruler of what had been the Median Empire. This is where Persia enters world history. Not as a self-designation, but as an outside label that would stick for 2.5 millennia. The Greeks, who were just starting to pay serious attention to events in the East, called Cyrus's homeland Persis. It came from Parsa, the Persian name for the region. To Greek ears, it sounded like Persis, and they extended that name to the entire empire. Never mind that Cyrus now ruled over Medes, Babylonians, Elamites, dozens of other peoples. Never mind that his empire stretched across territories with wildly different cultures and languages. The Greeks called it all Persia because the ruling dynasty came from Persis, and that name entered Western consciousness so deeply that it would outlast the empire itself by thousands of years. But Cyrus didn't stop with the Median territories. Maybe he couldn't. When you overthrow an empire through military force, you create a momentum that's hard to stop. Your soldiers expect rewards. Your new subjects need to be convinced you're strong enough to keep power. Neighboring kingdoms start making calculations about whether you're a threat or an opportunity. So Cyrus kept moving. Within a decade, he had conquered Lydia in western Anatolia, bringing him into direct contact with the Greek city-states of Ionia. He pushed east into Central Asia, subduing the Iranian peoples living in what's now Afghanistan and beyond. And then, in 539 BCE, he achieved the conquest that would echo through history, the one that would transform him from successful warlord to something approaching a mythological figure. He took Babylon, the city that had helped destroy Assyria, one of the greatest cities in the world, with walls so massive that ancient writers claimed chariot teams could drive along the top. A city with centuries of history, immense wealth, and a population that considered itself the pinnacle of civilization. Cyrus captured it almost without a fight. The Babylonian king Nabonidus had alienated his own priests and population. When Cyrus arrived, large portions of the city welcomed him as a liberator rather than a conqueror. This is where the Cyrus cylinder enters the story. It's a clay cylinder covered in Akkadian cuneiform, now in the British Museum, inscribed by order of Cyrus after his conquest of Babylon. It describes his victory and his policies, and it's been called the first declaration of human rights, though that's probably overstating things. What it actually is a piece of propaganda, a statement of Cyrus's legitimacy aimed at his new Babylonian subjects. But it's remarkably enlightened propaganda. Cyrus claims he restored the temples that previous rulers had neglected. He allowed peoples who'd been forcibly relocated to return to their homelands. He permitted the restoration of religious practices that had been suppressed. Most famously, he let the Jews who'd been exiled to Babylon return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This act earned him a unique place in biblical history as the only non-Jewish king called a Messiah, an anointed one of God. Was Cyrus really this tolerant and benevolent? Or was he just smart enough to realize that letting conquered peoples keep their customs made them easier to govern? Probably both. The tolerance was real. The vast Achaemenid empire that Cyrus founded couldn't have functioned if it tried to impose cultural uniformity. But the tolerance was also strategic. Cyrus understood that empires work better when people feel they have a stake in the system, rather than being crushed beneath it. Now here's where the naming issue gets really interesting. Because while the Greeks were busy calling Cyrus's realm Persia, Cyrus and his successors called it something else entirely. We know this because, unlike the Medes, the Achaemenid Persians left extensive inscriptions. At Beston, carved into a cliff face in what's now western Iran, King Darius I left a massive trilingual inscription in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital built by Darius, inscriptions appear throughout the complex, and these inscriptions don't call the empire Persia. They use variations of that ancient name, Arianam, the realm of the Aryans, the land of the Iranian peoples. So from the very beginning there were two names: Persia, the label applied by outsiders, primarily Greeks, that would dominate Western historical writing, and Iran, or its ancient equivalents, the name used by the people who actually lived there and the kings who ruled them, one empire viewed through two different linguistic lenses, creating a duality that would persist for millennia. Imagine standing at Persepolis during its height, maybe during the festival of Nowruz, the Persian New Year. The great ceremonial staircases lead up to massive platforms, and carved into the stone are processions of subject peoples, representatives from dozens of nations, each dressed in their distinctive clothing, each bringing tribute. Bactrians leading camels, Lydians carrying precious metals, Indians bringing exotic goods, Egyptians with their characteristic kilts and headdresses. This wasn't just political theater, though it was certainly that. It was a statement about what the empire actually was, a vast collection of peoples all acknowledging the authority of the King of Kings, but each maintaining their own identity. The Greek visitors who occasionally made their way to these ceremonies called it all Persia, but the inscriptions surrounding them told a different story. A story about an empire that saw itself as the culmination of Iranian civilization, the fulfillment of centuries of cultural and political development on the plateau. Two names, two perspectives, and a tension between insider and outsider views that would define how we remember this civilization for the next 2,500 years. That someone was Darius. Darius wasn't Cyrus's son. He was a distant relative, a member of another branch of the Achaemenid family. His rise to power, if you believe his own story, was an almost cinematic tale of treason, impostors, and heroic intervention. A usurper claiming to be Badia, Cyrus's murdered son, a conspiracy of 7 Persian nobles, a dramatic palace coup. That's his version, carved into stone. Convenient, flattering, impossible to verify. What we can see clearly is what he did once he got the throne. And this is where the Achaemenid Empire turns from big conquest state into something like a functioning global machine. Darius looked at the sprawling territories Cyrus had assembled and did something that very few conquerors manage. He organized them. He divided the empire into satrapies, administrative regions, each governed by a satrap, a kind of provincial governor. These weren't random borders. They usually followed older political and cultural regions: Lydia in Anatolia, Babylonia in Mesopotamia, Egypt in the Nile Valley, and so on. Each satrap collected taxes, raised troops, and enforced royal authority. But Darius didn't just hand out these positions and hope for the best. He built in redundancy. There were royal inspectors, the king's eyes and ears, who could travel anywhere, drop in unannounced, and report directly back to the court. There were separate military commanders who didn't answer to the satrap. There were royal treasuries that satraps couldn't easily plunder. It was a system designed to let local elites feel powerful, while making sure none of them could easily break away. To tie all of this together, Darius turned old paths and caravan routes into an artery, the Royal Road. From Susa in Elam, across Mesopotamia, up through Anatolia to Sardis near the Aegean, this road stretched almost 2,700 kilometers. It crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts. Along it, Darius placed stations at regular intervals, waypoints where messengers could rest, change horses, and pass on dispatches. This is where the Achaemenid postal system, the Angarion, comes in. Royal couriers rode this route at astonishing speed for the time. Herodotus, in one of his more famous lines, describes them: "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Centuries later, that description would be adopted, without the Persians ever being asked, for modern postal services far away from Iran. The idea is simple. If the King of Kings could get information from the edges of his empire within days or weeks instead of months, he could respond to threats before they turned into full-blown rebellions. Roads weren't just for trade, they were for control. Along with the roads and satrapies came money. Darius introduced standardized coinage, the famous gold daric and silver sigloi. Earlier empires had used metal by weight, local coins, or barter. Darius didn't abolish those practices overnight, but his coins provided a common reference point. Soldiers could be paid in a currency accepted from Egypt to Central Asia. Taxes could be calculated in standard units. Merchants could carry wealth in their pockets rather than in ox carts. You can feel the empire moving from loosely connected kingdoms into an integrated economic zone. And towering above all of this, literally and figuratively, was Darius's great manifesto, the Behistun inscription. High on a cliff in western Iran, Darius ordered a tableau carved into the rock. It shows him triumphant, 1 foot on a defeated rebel, with other rebels chained before him. Around the image, in 3 languages, runs a long text. In it, Darius tells you who he is: Darius the King, King of Kings, King of countries containing all kinds of men. He lists his lineage, his god Ahura Mazda, his victories over rebels who supposedly lied and pretended to be rightful kings. He claims he restored order, punished deceit, brought justice. This is history, but it's also advertising. It's the official story of how power should be understood. For centuries, travelers passing through that region would have seen it towering above them, a permanent reminder that whatever local politics they were dealing with, the real authority came from the Achaemenid king and from the Iranian heartland that produced him. And yet, even as the Achaemenids crafted this image of a universal empire, another story was being written far to the west, a story that would shape how most of the world remembered them. The Greeks. By Darius's time, the Achaemenid frontier touched the Aegean. Greek city-states in Ionia, what's now western Turkey, found themselves paying tribute to this distant king of kings. Some cooperated, some resented it. Under Darius, a revolt broke out, the Ionian Revolt. It failed, but it pulled mainland Greece into the orbit of Persian power. Darius decided to make an example. In 490 BCE, a Persian expedition crossed the Aegean and landed at Marathon near Athens. What followed would become one of the most famous battles in Western memory. An Athenian army, heavily outnumbered according to Greek sources, charged the Persians and somehow broke them. The details are debated. The propaganda is not. For the Athenians, Marathon became a symbol. Small free citizens defeating the vast forces of an Eastern autocrat. 10 years later, under Darius's son Xerxes, the conflict escalated. Huge bridges across the Hellespont, carved canals, massive armies according to Greek accounts. Again, the numbers are almost certainly exaggerated, but the spectacle was real. Greek cities that had bickered for generations suddenly confronted the possibility of being reduced to just another satrapy. The battles that followed, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, became the founding myths of the West in later European storytelling. A small band of Spartans dying to the last man at a mountain pass, a brilliant naval ambush in the straits near Athens, a final land victory driving the Persians back. For the Achaemenids, these were border conflicts at the far western edge of a vast empire. For the Greeks, they were existential struggles, and the Greeks were the ones who wrote the books that would be copied, reread, and taught for centuries in Europe. At the center of that Greek narrative is Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE. He's often called the father of history. He traveled, he interviewed, he collected stories and then tried to weave them into a coherent account of how a world dominated by Persia had come to be, and how tiny Greek communities had pushed back. Over and over, he calls the Achaemenid Empire simply Persia, and its people Persians. He describes their customs, their roads, their postal system, their kings. He admires some things, criticizes others, peppers his narrative with anecdotes that may or may not be true. But in his telling, the empire is defined by the people of Persia, not by the broader Iranian world, and certainly not by the empire's own name for itself. Later, Greek and Roman writers followed his lead. For them, the great Eastern superpower was always Persis, and its rulers Persai. Even long after the Achaemenid dynasty fell, any Iranian-led empire, Parthian Sassanid, tended to be squeezed into that same label, Persia. So for more than 2,000 years in European languages, this is how the memory solidified. Greece, Rome, Persia, a triangle of identities, with one corner cast as the East, the other as the West. The irony is that inside the empire, the Achaemenid vision was far more pluralistic and far more universal. Darius and his successors didn't just see themselves as kings of Persians. In their own inscriptions, they're kings of all peoples, rulers of this great earth far and wide. They listed subject nations not as a generic mass, but as distinct communities: Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, Indians, Sogdians, and many more. The reliefs at Persepolis show each delegation in its own costume, carrying its own particular gifts, often led hand in hand by a Persian official, rather than being dragged in chains. In the Achaemenid worldview, the court at Persepolis or Susa was not the center of Persia, narrowly defined, but the axis of a world empire. An Iranian dynasty sat at the top. Persian nobles held privileged positions, but Armenians were generals, Medes were administrators, Babylonians were scribes, and Egyptians handled temple finances. The empire was a layered mosaic, not a monolith. To call all of this simply Persia is to look through the Greek lens, narrow, competitive, obsessed with the wars that happened at the margins. From inside, the picture was different. A universal monarchy ruling over lands of many tons, an Iranian-led but multi-ethnic cosmos. That tension between inner and outer names, between Iran and Persia, would only grow sharper in the centuries to come, because the order that Darius and Xerxes built, the network of satrapies and roads and coins and couriers, wasn't eternal. In the 4th century BCE, another ambitious young king would appear in the West, one who had grown up hearing Greek stories of Persian arrogance and Greek heroism, one who decided to flip the script and carry war eastward, into the very heart of the empire that had once threatened his world. Alexander would break the Achaemenid state, but he wouldn't erase the Iranian idea beneath it. When Alexander finally came, the Achaemenid Empire wasn't a crumbling ruin. It was wounded, strained by court intrigues and regional revolts, but still the largest political machine on earth. He was 22. He'd grown up with Homer as bedtime reading and Herodotus as cautionary tale. In his world, Persia was the giant his father had tried to topple and never quite managed to reach. Alexander didn't inherit Cyrus's road system or Darius's satrapies. He inherited Greek memories of Marathon and Salamis, and a sense that history had given him a score to settle. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with a relatively small army by imperial standards, maybe 40,000 men. Not the endless hordes Greek storytellers had once imagined coming from the east, but a highly trained spear point. At the Granicus River, at Issus, at Gaugamela, his forces met those of Darius III. The details of those battles have been told and retold, layered with propaganda on both sides. What does seem clear is that the old imperial structure couldn't coordinate its response fast enough. Satrapal armies fought piecemeal. Court factions undermined each other. Alexander moved faster than the bureaucracy could react. Within a few years, the unthinkable had happened. The King of Kings was on the run, then dead. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, Ecbatana. One by one, the great capitals opened their gates, and then came the fire. In 330 BCE, Alexander arrived at Persepolis, that ceremonial heart of Achaemenid power. The terraces, the reliefs, the columns that had seen delegations from 30 subject peoples bearing gifts. Now they watched a foreign king walk up the stairways of the Apadana. What happened next is murky. Later Greek accounts tell a story of a drunken banquet, a courtesan suggesting that they burn the palace in revenge for Xerxes' sack of Athens. Alexander impulsively agreeing, torches brought, curtains ignited, flames racing through the wooden roofs. Other traditions hint at a more calculated message, a symbolic end to Persian imperial glory, a statement that the old order was over. Whatever the motives, Persepolis burned, roofs collapsed, painted beams turned to ash. The stone relief survived, scarred and blackened, but the inner life of the palace complex was gone. It might feel like a clean break. Old empire destroyed, new conqueror triumphant. But Alexander's next moves complicate the picture, because he didn't just want to destroy Persia, he wanted to inherit it. Very quickly, Alexander began presenting himself not only as a Macedonian war leader, but as a successor to Darius. He adopted elements of Achaemenid court ritual. He wore Iranian-style dress at times. He married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, and later arranged mass weddings at Susa between his officers and women from Iranian aristocratic families. He kept the satrapy system. Often he simply replaced a dead or disloyal satrap with another, sometimes Macedonian, sometimes local. He employed Persian nobles in high positions. He visited Zoroastrian fire temples and is said to have made offerings, not as a convert, but as a king who understood that respecting local gods was part of ruling their people. In his short life, you can see him experimenting with something new, a fusion monarchy, Greek and Macedonian on one side, Iranian and imperial Achaemenid on the other. Not everyone liked this. His Macedonian companions grumbled at the sight of their king adopting Persian court customs, expecting proskynesis, ritual prostration, from them as he did from Eastern courtiers. Alexander tried to stand at the center of a blended world, but the edges kept tugging. Then, at 32, he died in Babylon. Fever, poison, complications of old wounds. No one knows for sure. What we do know is that the empire he'd carved out in a decade was too much for any one successor to hold. His generals, Diadochi, successors, split it like a carcass. Out of this chaos emerged a new ruling house over much of the old Iranian heartland, the Seleucids, named after Seleucus, one of Alexander's generals who managed, through alliance and opportunism, to secure Babylon, then much of the eastern territories. On paper, the Seleucid Empire was Greek. Its court language was Greek. Its rulers took Greek names: Seleucus, Antiochus, Demetrius. They founded cities with Greek-style institutions and Greek-sounding names: Seleucia on the Tigris, Antioch, and dozens more. They minted coins with Hellenistic imagery. Philosophers and poets from the Greek world found patronage in their courts. But look at a map, and you see the irony immediately. Most of their territory wasn't Greek at all. It was the same vast Iranian and Near Eastern world the Achaemenids had ruled. Mesopotamia, Syria, parts of Anatolia, and crucially, the Iranian plateau. So everyday life didn't suddenly become Greek. Imagine a small valley in what's now Fars or Media. The Seleucid king in far-off Antioch issues decrees in Greek. A governor, maybe with a Greek name but married into a local noble family, sits in a fortified town. In the market, Greek merchants haggle over silk and spices, their words laced with accents from the islands and the Aegean. But just a few hills away, in a stone-walled compound, a Zoroastrian fire temple still burns. Priests in white robes tend the flame, reciting prayers in Avestan and old Iranian dialects. Farmers bring offerings, whispering wishes for good harvests in their own languages. Children grow up hearing stories of Yamshid and Zahak, of heroes and kings whose names never appear in Greek chronicles. This is where something subtle but crucial survives: an Iranian way of seeing the world. Later texts will call the ideal Iranian realm Eran Shah, the domain of the Iranians. Under the early Seleucids, that word isn't yet plastered on coins or carved on cliff faces. But the idea behind it, of a cultural zone defined by language, law, religion, and memory, doesn't vanish with the Achaemenid state. In cities, you would have heard Greek in council meetings and legal contracts, Aramaic in everyday administration, and a variety of Iranian dialects in streets and workshops. In the countryside, especially in the eastern regions, Parthia, Hyrcania, Bactria, Sobtia, local Iranian speech dominated. Zoroastrianism didn't evaporate, it adjusted. Temples continued, fire cults persisted. The magi of priestly families carried on rituals, sometimes with royal support, sometimes on the patronage of local nobles who didn't care much whether the distant king's inscriptions were in Greek or Old Persian, as long as their estates remained intact. Many satrapal families simply survived the transition. They served Achaemenid kings, then Alexander, then Seleucid rulers. The names at the top changed. The deeper structures, land-holding, village organization, religious life, shifted more slowly. You can almost think of the Seleucid period as a layered palimpsest. On the top level, Greek city foundations, gymnasia, theater festivals, coins with Athena and Apollo, official decrees addressed to the Greeks and the barbarians. Underneath, Iranian clan networks, Zoroastrian law, stories of kings and heroes, an inherited sense that this land between Zagros and Hindu Kush was not just territory, but homeland. Hellenism met Zoroastrianism not as equal partners, but as overlapping systems. Some local elites sent their sons to Greek-style schools, and gave them Greek names alongside Iranian ones. Others stayed in more traditional circles. In some regions, you might get hybrid practices, Greek deities interpreted through Iranian lenses, Iranian gods given Greek equivalents. Over time, this produced a complex cultural texture. Bilingual inscriptions, coins with Greek legends issued by Iranian rulers, Iranian gods worshipped in temples with Hellenistic architecture. And yet, as you move east, away from the Mediterranean and deeper into the old Achaemenid core, the grip of the Seleucid starts to loosen. Part of it was geography. The further you go into Iran and Central Asia, the harder it is for a Western-based dynasty to enforce direct control. Mountains, deserts, and sheer distance turned satrapies into semi-independent kingdoms whenever central authority wavered. Part of it was politics. The Seleucid kings faced constant pressure in the West, from Egyptians, from rival Hellenistic states, from restless Greek cities. Their attention was pulled toward the Mediterranean, leaving eastern provinces to fend for themselves. Local dynasts took advantage. In Bactria, on the far northeastern edge, a Greek-speaking elite broke away and formed the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, Hellenistic in culture, but increasingly Iranian in environment. In Parthia, a region of steppe and hill east of the Caspian, Iranian-speaking nobles watched carefully. They saw that behind the Greek veneer, power could be seized. In these eastern lands, the memory of Iranian-led empire hadn't died with Darius III. It lived in oral traditions, in court ceremonies, in the very terms people use for king and realm. Some of those ideas would crystallize over the next century into something new, an explicitly Iranian dynasty rising within and then against the Seleucid world. As Seleucid governors in the east became more autonomous, as Greek cities looked inward, as royal armies struggled to appear on distant frontiers, the conditions quietly ripened. The sacred fires still burned. The old languages still rolled off tongues in markets and mountain villages. The notion that this was, at its core, an Iranian land, a future Iran Shah, was waiting. Soon riders from the northeast, speaking an Iranian language, and led by chiefs with modest titles, would begin to claim more. First local power, then regional, then imperial. The age of Greek political dominance over the Iranian plateau was already starting to fray, even as Greek merchants still counted their coins in bustling Seleucid bazaars. In that widening gap between appearance and reality, between Greek kingship and Iranian continuity, the Parthian revival was about to be born. The first time you hear their name, it sounds almost like a footnote. Parthians, not as famous as Persians, not as romanticized as Spartans or legions. But if you were living on the Iranian plateau in the 3rd century BCE, they were the rumor on the wind, horsemen from the northeast, clan chieftains who didn't seem impressed by Greek titles. Their story starts far from marble colonnades and coastal cities. It begins in the borderlands where steppe fades into mountain, in a region the sources call Parthia, east of the Caspian Sea. Here, Iranian-speaking tribes had lived for generations, riding, herding, fighting small wars over grazing land and tribute. They weren't desert nomads in the purest sense, but they weren't settled city dwellers either. Think of them as something in between, semi-nomadic aristocrats who measured wealth in horses, followers, and oaths. Under the Achaemenids, Parthia had been a satrapy. Under the Seleucids, it was supposed to stay that way. But in the middle of the 3rd century BCE, a Seleucid authority flickered in the east. A man named Arsaces, Arshak in Iranian form, made a decision that, at the time, probably felt more like a local gamble than a world historic move. He rebelled. The details are hazy. Later historians, mostly Greek and Roman, don't linger on the early Parthians until they're forced to. What seems likely is that Arsaces was either a local chieftain or a leader of a confederation of clans with ties to the steppe. He seized control of Parthia around 247 BCE, ousting or sidelining the Seleucid-appointed governor. On one level, it was just another provincial revolt. On another, it was something else. The first successful reassertion of Iranian-led power over a piece of the old Achaemenid heartland since Alexander's conquests. Arsaces and his successors took his name as a dynastic title, the Sassanids. At first, their realm was small, squeezed between other powers, Seleucids to the west, Greco-Bactrian rulers to the east, nomadic groups beyond. But they had time on their side. Seleucid kings were busy fighting each other, fighting in Syria, fighting in Anatolia, fighting everywhere except the one place that would eventually matter most, the Iranian interior. While royal crowns changed hands in Antioch, the Sassanids did something deceptively simple. They survived, they fortified, they learned. They adopted some Seleucid-style administration when it suited them, minted coins, struck treaties, took on high-sounding titles, but their real strength rested on older pillars: clan loyalty, cavalry warfare, knowledge of the harsh landscapes between steppe and mountain. Over the next century, they expanded step by step: Hyrcania, Media, Mesopotamia. Not in a straight line, not without reverses, but with a kind of patient resilience. By the late 2nd century BCE, the map had flipped. The empire that once ruled Parthia was now being pushed back by Parthia. The Seleucid state shrank to a fragment of Syria. The Sassanid kings, riding out from the northeast, now claimed as their own cities whose walls had once echoed in Old Persian, then in Greek, and now in something new: an Iranian revivalist voice wrapped in Hellenistic forms. If you could have walked into their capital at its height, you'd feel that blend immediately. The Parthians chose as their main royal residence not a high plateau fortress, but a city on the Tigris, Ctesiphon, just across from the old Seleucid foundation of Seleucia on the Tigris. This twin-city complex near today's Baghdad became the beating heart of their empire. In Ctesiphon, you'd see Greek-speaking merchants tallying accounts. You'd hear Aramaic scribes recording transactions. But in the royal camp, among nobles and generals, you'd hear Parthian and other Iranian dialects, old words for lord, clan, fire. Parthian rule was famously decentralized. Rather than trying to imitate the more tightly controlled Achaemenid model, they leaned into a kind of imperial feudalism. The Sassanid king sat at the top, but below him were powerful noble houses, semi-independent dynasties with their own territories, troops, and traditions. Some had roots going back to Achaemenid times. Others rose with the Parthians themselves. They owed allegiance, tribute, and military service to the King of Kings, but within their own domains they wielded considerable autonomy. To a Greek or Roman observer used to centralized states, this looked like chaos. To the Parthians, it was a flexible lattice of obligations, kinship, and prestige. Religiously and culturally, they also blended. Parthian kings allowed Greek cities to keep their institutions. They printed Greek legends on many of their coins. On some early issues, they even called themselves Philhellene, friends of the Greeks. This wasn't because they secretly wanted to be Greek. It was diplomacy, branding, a way of reassuring urban elites and Mediterranean traders that they were civilized rulers, not barbarians from the steppe. But flip the coin, literally or metaphorically, and you see something else. On the same coins, or in parallel inscriptions, Parthian kings used titles that reach back to Achaemenid grandeur. King of Kings, an echo of Shayathia Shayatianum, the old Persian formula. In the languages they spoke at home, in the myths they patronized, in the fires they endowed, they were not Philhellenes first. They were Iranian rulers of an Iranian realm. This dual identity became even clearer as they faced a new rival from the west: Rome. By the 1st century BCE, the Parthian Empire formed the eastern wall of the Roman world. Between them lay contested lands: Armenia, northern Mesopotamia, Syria's fringes. Here, for centuries, Roman legions and Parthian horsemen would test each other's limits. One encounter, in particular, burned itself into Roman memory: the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE. A Roman triumvir, Marcus Licinius Crassus, rich, ambitious, eager for glory to match Caesar and Pompey, marched east with a large army, imagining an easy campaign against barbarians. He met something else. Parthian generals brought to the field what may have looked at first glance like a lighter force, but their strength wasn't in dense infantry. It was in cavalry, heavily armored cataphracts with lances, and above all, horse archers. On the flat plains near Carrhae, Parthian riders executed tactics that would become legendary. They swarmed, encircled, feigned retreat. They loosed showers of arrows from a distance Roman infantry found hard to answer. They used a maneuver that later writers would call the Parthian shot, firing backward at pursuers while riding away at speed. Crassus's army, weighed down by heavy armor, unaccustomed to this kind of fluid warfare, was ground down. Thousands died. Standards, the eagle-topped emblems of Rome's legions, fell into Parthian hands. For Rome, this was a humiliation. For Parthia, it was a statement. In later decades, that memory hung over negotiations and wars. When Augustus came to power, he made a diplomatic priority of recovering those captured standards. The Parthian king eventually returned them as part of a carefully staged exchange. Statues in Rome celebrated this as a victory. But everyone understood the subtext. Rome might dominate the Mediterranean, but in the east there was another empire, equally proud, equally ancient in its self-conception. And underneath these imperial rivalries, something quieter continued. Names. Latin and Greek writers kept calling the great eastern power Parthia, or Persis. To them, Persia was a convenient shorthand for the whole Iranian world, even though, by this time, Persis, the region of Fars, was just one part of a much larger Parthian-dominated landscape. But internally, among Iranian elites, a different term was slowly crystallizing. Words related to Aryan, area, Iran, had long been used in Iranian languages to distinguish our people, our lands, from those of others. Under the Arsacids, these words didn't yet appear in big stone proclamations the way they would under the Sassanids, but they circulated in oral tradition, legal language, and self-description. The idea of an Iranian world, not in the modern national sense but as a cultural and religious sphere, gathered strength. Part of that strength came from religion. Zoroastrianism under the Parthians was not a centralized church with fixed scriptures and hierarchy. It was a web of traditions, fire cults, priestly families, ritual practices that varied by region but shared common roots. Parthian nobles endowed fire temples. Sacred flames burned in their estates, their capitals, their border fortresses. Priests recited hymns in Avestan and Middle Iranian dialects, preserving cosmological ideas that stretched back to pre-Achaemenid times, a universe divided between truth and the lie, light and darkness, Ahura Mazda and his adversaries. Much of what we know as the Avesta today was still, then, largely oral, memorized, chanted, passed from master to apprentice. Written manuscripts may have existed in some form, but the main archive was human memory. Alongside religious chants, another kind of memory flourished. Epic. In noble houses, in winter halls and summer camps, professional storytellers, Ghassans and later Naqals, recited tales of ancient Iranian heroes, of Rustam and Esfandia, of Zahak the serpent-shouldered tyrant, of Jamshid's lost glory, of Kayanian kings who fought demonic invaders from the north. These stories were not yet the Shahnameh. That would come much later, under Islamic-era poets like Ferdowsi. But the raw material was already alive under the Parthians, shaped in Parthian and other Middle Iranian tongues. In a world where Greek remained the prestige language of many cities and Latin inscriptions would one day dot the western fringes, these epic cycles did something important. They kept alive a sense that the deepest stories of the land were not about Achilles or Aeneas, but about Iranian heroes and Iranian kings fighting to defend Iran against Anaran, Iran against the non-Iranian. So when a Parthian noble rode into battle under an Sassanid banner, he wasn't just a client of horse lords from the northeast. He was a participant in a much older saga, one that tied him, through ritual, language, and legend, to Achaemenid courtiers, to earlier tribal chiefs, to mythic figures half remembered in the dark. In this way, the Parthian Empire became a bridge. On the surface, it looked like a hybrid Hellenistic monarchy with feudal overtones, locked in a long chess match with Rome. Underneath, it was incubating something more intangible, a rearticulated Iranian identity that did not need Greek approval to feel legitimate. By the time Parthian power began to wane, and new challenges rose from the southwest with even sharper ideas about what Iran should mean, the groundwork had been laid. The sacred fires were still burning. The epic stories were still being sung. The phrase, King of Kings, had found new lips to speak it. The next dynasty would etch a word into rock that had so far mostly lived in stories and prayers, Iran-Shah, the realm of Iran. And with that, Iran would stop being just a feeling and start becoming a formal name. It looked like a provincial revolt. In the early 3rd century CE, down in Persia, in Fars, that old Achaemenid heartland that had never quite forgotten its glory, a local noble family was watching our Sassanid power fray. Their ancestor, we're told, was a priest of the fire temple at a place called Istakhr, near the ruins of Persepolis. His name was Sassan. From him, the dynasty would take its name, Sassanid. His descendant, Ardashir in Middle Persian, began like so many regional strongmen before him, a local ruler under loose Parthian suzerainty, governing a small corner, swearing formal loyalty while quietly building real strength. But if the Parthian Empire had been a web of oaths by the 220s CE, too many of those threads were fraying at once. Noble houses fought their own feuds. Rome pressed on the western borders. Internal succession disputes weakened the Sassanid court. Ardashir saw his opening. He started close to home, conquering neighboring cities and fortresses in Fars. Then he pushed outward, into Khuzestan, into central Iran. The local nobility, tired of disunity, sometimes joined him, sometimes resisted, and were absorbed. At first, the Sassanid king, Artabanus IV, may have seen these moves as just another troublesome satrap grown overconfident. But Ardashir didn't stop. His campaigns climbed up the Iranian plateau like a slow, deliberate fire. The showdown came round 224 CE at a battle near Hormozgan. The sources are sparse and sometimes contradictory, but the outcome is clear. Ardashir's forces defeated Artabanus. The last Parthian king died on the field, and with him, centuries of Sassanid rule. What rose in his place was not just another house of horse lords. Ardashir was thinking bigger. After his victory, he did something revealing. He didn't just call himself king. He took a very specific title, in a very deliberate form, Shahanshah Iran, King of Kings of Iran. Here, for the first time in surviving royal proclamations, that old half-mythic word, Iran, stepped out of songs, prayers, and private self-descriptions, and into the official language of empire. It meant, roughly, the land of the Aryans, the realm of the Iranian peoples, but now it was more than a cultural feeling. It was a jurisdiction, a claim. On rock reliefs and inscriptions, Ardashir and his successors did something the Parthians had hesitated to do. They carved Iran-Shah, the realm of Iran, into stone. At Nakshi Rustam, the ancient Achaemenid necropolis. Ardashir had his story etched literally beneath the tombs of Darius and Xerxes. In one great scene, you can still trace the outlines through the weathering. On one side, Ardashir on horseback receiving a royal diadem from Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrianism. Under the hooves of Ardashir's horse lies the fallen Artabanus. Under Ahura Mazda's horse lies a demonic figure, Ahriman, the enemy of truth. The message is not subtle. The new king is not just a successful warlord. He is the champion of truth, defeating the lie, the restorer of right order in both the human and cosmic realms. The Sassanid coup is framed as a religious event, a cleansing of the world for the sake of Iran. And that word, Iran, now has edges. On Ardashir's coins and inscriptions, the full royal style appears, Mazda worshipping, divine Ardashir, king of kings of Iran, whose lineage is from the gods. Later rulers would elaborate, king of kings of Iran and non-Iran, when they controlled territories beyond what they understood as the Iranian cultural sphere. The distinction between Iran and Aniran, between the Iranian realm and the lands outside it, was now written into the titles of the throne. Political geography had taken on a new, explicitly Iranian frame. Under Ardashir's son, Shapur I, this frame expanded and hardened. Shapur inherited not only his father's ambitions, but also his enemies. To the west, Rome, by now transformed into a sprawling empire, whose eastern frontier brushed against Mesopotamia and Armenia. The Sassanids did not see themselves as junior partners in any shared world order. In their own inscriptions, they spoke as equals or superiors to Rome. Shapur's greatest propaganda piece lies at Naqshi-Rustam too, a rock relief showing a Roman Emperor Valerian kneeling grasped by the Sassanid king, while another Roman, perhaps Philip the Arab, stands nearby. In the Latin and Greek traditions, this scene was an embarrassment. In Sassanid art, it was a centerpiece. Twice in his long reign, Shapur invaded Roman territory. He took Antioch, deported whole populations eastward, and at Edessa, in 260 CE, he accomplished something no Eastern king had yet managed. He captured a Roman emperor alive. The court chroniclers and priests must have savored that moment. In Shapur's great trilingual inscription at Kabaya-Zardosht, he lists his titles in Middle Persian, Parthian, and Greek, and carefully sets out the provinces of Iran-Shah, from Pars and Khuzestan to Khwarezm and Sogdia, from Mesopotamia to parts of the Caucasus. He describes a realm that is not just a patchwork of subject peoples, but a coherent Iran. Inside that realm, the Sassanids set about doing something the Parthians had never fully attempted, building a centralized, ideologically unified state. At the core of that project was religion. Zoroastrianism became, under the Sassanids, a true state faith. Not just a network of fire cults, but a structured church with high priests, councils, and a canon. Priests called Mobeds and Urbed rose to positions of political influence. A chief priest, the Maubedan Mobed, priest of priests, stood almost like a counterpart to the Shahanshah, overseeing ritual purity, doctrine, and the vast temple estates that dotted the empire. The sacred texts, long held chiefly in oral tradition, began to be codified more systematically. Avestan hymns, ritual instructions, and commentaries were gathered, ordered, and written down in script adapted for the purpose. What we now know as the Avesta bears traces of this Sassanid editorial hand. It was an act of cultural conservation, but also of definition. To be part of Iran was, increasingly, to stand under the fires of Ahura Mazda, to live within the cosmic drama of good versus evil, to honor the Azatas and hold back the forces of Druj, the Lei. This didn't mean the empire was religiously uniform. Jews, Christians, Manichaeans, and others lived within its borders, but the official narrative of the state was unmistakably Zoroastrian and unmistakably Iranian. Alongside temples and courts, Another kind of institution flourished: centers of learning. One, in particular, stands out in later memory: the Academy of Gondishapur in Khuzestan. Part hospital, part university, part translation center, Gondishapur gathered physicians and scholars from across Iran and beyond. Greek medical texts, Indian astronomical law, local Iranian knowledge, they all mixed there, translated into Middle Persian and Syriac, discussed, commented on. Centuries later, under the early Islamic caliphates, many of Gondishapur's physicians would transmit this blended knowledge into Arabic, seeding what would become the great scientific flowering of the Abbasid age. Under the Sassanids, though, it was already a sign of something important. Iran Shah saw itself not just as an empire of armies and taxes, but as a custodian of wisdom. Culture seeped outward in quieter ways, too. Somewhere in this Sassanid world, perhaps at court, perhaps in noble houses between battles, a board game imported and adapted from India took on a new form. Chatrang, the ancestor of what we now call chess. Its pieces encoded the structure of a Sassanid army and court: king, vizier, elephants, chariots, cavalry. The games spread along trade routes, passed into the Islamic world as shatranj, then to Europe as chess. Today, when you move a king across 64 squares, you're playing with a distant echo of Sassanid strategy and royal imagery. Another pastime also carried their fingerprints: polo. Known as chogan in Persian, it began as a training exercise for cavalry. Fast horses, long mallets, a ball flying across fields while aristocrats honed their riding and coordination. It became a favorite sport of Sassanid elites, painted in later miniatures as the leisure of kings. From there, it too traveled into Central Asia to India, and eventually into British colonial hands. Modern polo clubs, immaculate lawns, and polished mallets are the refined descendants of Sassanid horse games on windy plains. Meanwhile, on the frontiers, the centuries-long duel with Rome, later Byzantium, continued. Over Armenia, over Mesopotamia, over the great arteries of trade that linked India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean, Sassanid and Roman armies marched, retreated, negotiated, and marched again. Cities like Nisibis, Dara, and Divin changed hands, were fortified, besieged, refortified. To Greek and Latin writers, the eastern enemy was often still Persia. To Sassanid kings, they were the defenders of Iran Shah against Aniran. This wasn't just a convenient slogan. It shaped law codes, tax systems, even urban planning. Fire temples, royal roads, provincial governors, Mars-bens were all woven into a picture where the world was divided into the shining ordered realm of Iran and the chaos beyond its walls. Epic tradition fed into this. Stories of mythic Kayanian kings battling Turanian foes from the northeast were recast as ancestral memories of Iran's eternal struggle with its enemies. The line between legend and policy blurred. When a Sassanid ruler claimed to be heir to the Kayanian throne, or to the Achaemenids before them, he was situating his court inside a story that stretched back before history. That story of a sacred land, bounded not just by borders but by a shared culture and destiny, outlasted the dynasty that promoted it. By the early 7th century, the Sassanid Empire was exhausted. Endless wars with Byzantium, internal coups, plague, and economic strain had hollowed out the state. Brilliant rulers like Khusro I had reformed tax systems and patronized learning, but his successors faced a world that was changing faster than their institutions could adapt. From the southwest, out of Arabia, a new force was stirring, carrying a new religion and a new political model. When the early Muslim armies crossed into Sassanid territory, they did not invade a nameless land. They crossed into Iran Shah, a realm whose people already thought of themselves as belonging to Iran. The dynasty would fall, but the word it had carved into rock whispered in rituals, sung in epics, and stamped on coins, would not. Iran had become more than a memory of Achaemenid glory, or a scholar's term in hidden manuscripts. It was a living official name, a civilizational idea strong enough to pass through conquest and keep going on the other side. When the blow finally landed, it landed fast. Within a single generation, the empire that had traded victories and defeats with Rome for centuries was gone. From the perspective of the early Muslim armies, though, it didn't feel like the collapse of some eternal superpower. It felt like a series of campaigns, each one improbably successful, stacking on top of the last. It began in the 600s and 30s. Arab tribes who had recently unified under the banner of Islam crossed the borders into the lands the Sassanids called Iranian. Some had served as auxiliaries on those frontiers before. They knew the terrain. They knew that the great empire to the north and east was staggering from war and plague. The first major clash came at a place that would become legendary in Islamic memory. Qadisiyah, around 636 CE. Sassanid armies, still formidable on paper, brought war elephants, heavy cavalry, noble lineages with long traditions of command. The Arab forces brought mobility, cohesion, and something else that is harder to pin down: a fierce, simple sense of purpose, wrapped in a new faith. These sources don't line up cleanly on what exactly happened on that battlefield. Later, Muslim accounts tell of a desperate multi-day fight, of elephants driven off, of shifting winds and dust. What most historians agree on is the outcome. The Sassanid field army broke. After Qadisiyah came the fall of Ctesiphon, Madain to the Arabs, the great winter capital on the Tigris. Its palaces were stripped, its storerooms emptied, its famous arch left standing over a new order. But even then, Iranian did not simply roll over. The last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, was little more than a boy when the invasions began. He fled eastward from city to city, court to court, trying to rally resistance. Governors hesitated. Some defected. Others fought and lost. At Nahavand, sometimes called the Victory of Victories in Islamic tradition, another decisive battle shattered Sassanid hopes of reconquest. Yazdegerd kept moving, into Fars, then Kerman, then farther east to Sistan and Merv. He was killed around 651 CE, perhaps by a local miller, perhaps by conspirators hoping to win favor with the new rulers. The details blur. What matters is that no Sassanid came after him. On paper, the fall is shockingly quick. In roughly 20 years, most of Iranian passes under Arab-Muslim control. But if you zoom in, the picture looks different. Conquest is one thing. Transformation is another. In the older Zoroastrian imagination, empires came and went, but the cosmic order remained. Fire altars still burned. Priests still recited the Gathas. Communities still traced their lineages back to ancient heroes. Those did not vanish overnight. Islam arrived as both a faith and a political system. It brought new tax structures, new legal norms, a new sacred language, Arabic, and a new center of gravity, first in Medina, then Damascus, then Baghdad. To the early caliphs, Iran was a set of provinces. To the people living there, it was still their land, with their own memories of kings and heroes, their own rituals and stories. Religiously, the change was gradual, uneven, and sometimes surprisingly quiet. At first, many of the conquered remained Zoroastrian. Under Islamic law, they were treated broadly like other people of the book, taxed, restricted in some ways, but generally allowed to practice their faith. In villages and small towns, fire temples kept burning. Priestly families continued to pass down chants and rites. Some of the Zoroastrian texts we possess were written or recopied in this period by communities trying to hold on to a shrinking world. Conversion to Islam happened in waves. Some individuals converted early, drawn by conviction, attracted by the new community, or simply hoping to avoid the extra taxes levied on non-Muslims. Others converted for more practical reasons, to access state offices, to join the armies that now paid stipends and coin. Over generations, families that had been Zoroastrian became Muslim. Their children grew up hearing the Quran, learning Arabic phrases, fasting in Ramadan. But they also grew up speaking Persian at home, eating the same foods, remembering the same pre-Islamic kings as part of their own distant story. The old faith receded, but it did not vanish completely. Pockets of Zoroastrian survived in places like Fars and Yazd, and later some would leave for India, becoming the Parsi communities. They remained living reminders that Iran had been something else, long before it became overwhelmingly Muslim. As belief shifted, language adapted. Under the Sassanids, the language of administration and high culture had been Middle Persian, Pahlavi, written in a script so condensed and ambiguous that only trained scribes could comfortably read it. In the new Islamic order, Arabic quickly became the language of government, theology, and science. For a while, it looked like Persian might simply melt into the background as a local spoken dialect, never again a vehicle for high literature. But languages, like identities, are stubborn things. What happened instead was a transformation. Spoken forms of Persian, already evolving on their own, began to be written again, this time in a modified Arabic script, absorbing a heavy layer of Arabic vocabulary and Islamic concepts. Over a few centuries, what we call New Persian emerged, recognizably Iranian in its bones, but dressed in new clothing. The earliest substantial texts in this New Persian appear under Iranian or Iran-centered Muslim dynasties, the Tahirids, Saffarids, and especially the Sassanids, ruling from Bukhara and Samarkand in the 9th and 10th centuries. They were Muslims. Their courts patronized Arabic scholars. But when it came to poetry, history, and the quieter currents of cultural memory, they turned to Persian. This was not an accident. By the 8th and 9th centuries, some non-Arab Muslims, especially in Iran and Central Asia, had begun to chafe at the way Arab elites claimed prestige simply by birth, presenting themselves as inherently superior within the new Ummah. The pushback took shape in a loose, multi-layered movement later called Shu'ubiyya, from an Arabic word meaning peoples or nations. Shu'ub writers did something daring. They accepted Islam. They revered the Prophet. They quoted the Quran, but they refused to accept Arab ethnic superiority as a given. In their poems and treatises, they extolled the achievements of non-Arab peoples, especially the Iranians. They praised Sassanid administrative sophistication, pre-Islamic learning, and the etiquette of Persian courts. They pointed out that Islam had spread eastward on the backs of these older cultures, not into empty space. Sometimes the arguments were playful, mock boastful. Sometimes they were sharp, even bitter. But beneath them ran a simple claim. Being Muslim did not mean erasing older identities. One could be fully part of the Islamic world and still proudly Ajam, non-Arab, Iranian. The medium for much of this was language itself. As Persian re-emerged as a literary language, poets began to test its limits. Could it carry the same philosophical weight as Arabic? Could it sing, argue, mourn, and praise with equal depth? By the late 10th century, one poet set himself a particularly audacious task. His name was Abul Qasim Ferdowsi, from Tus, in northeastern Iran. He decided to take the scattered body of Iranian myths, legends, and royal annals, stories preserved in Middle Persian prose, in oral epics sung by minstrels, in half-remembered chronicles, and weave them into a single vast poem in New Persian. He called it the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. It took him decades. Around 1010 CE, he completed a work of about 60,000 couplets, making it one of the longest epic poems in the world. In its pages, world-creating kings, dragon-slaying heroes, Tragic princes, wise viziers, and flawed rulers all move against the backdrop of a land called Iran, struggling perpetually against its neighbors, especially Tehran to the northeast. Ferdowsi made a deliberate stylistic choice. He kept Arabic loanwords to a minimum, reaching deep into the native resources of Persian, reviving old terms, crafting new compounds. He wasn't rejecting Islam. He was a Muslim himself, but he was proving that Persian could on its own carry the weight of an entire civilizational memory. Reading the Shahnameh, a listener in the 11th century could feel something remarkable, that the story of Iran did not begin with Islam, nor end with the Sassanids. It stretched back into semi-mythic antiquity and forward into their own time, like an unbroken thread. It is hard to overstate how influential this was. Under the Sassanids in the east and the Buyids in western Iran and Iraq, both dynasties of Iranian origin who, at various points, held real power, while caliphs in Baghdad receded into ceremonial roles, Persian language and Iranian themes surged back into political life. Court titles, coin inscriptions, architectural programs, and historical chronicles all began to speak more openly of Iran and Iran Shah again, even as Friday sermons invoked Allah and His Prophet. An Iranian general could lead Muslim armies. An Iranian vizier could administer a vast caliphate. An Iranian poet could sit in a Muslim court and recite tales of Rustam, of Jamshid, of the fall of Zahak, and be richly rewarded. The old names and the new faith had learned to coexist. Arab tribes had conquered the Sassanid Empire. Islam had taken deep root in Iranian soil. Arabic had flooded Persian with new words and concepts. And yet, under all of that, the sense of belonging to Iran, to a land with its own heroes, its own memories, its own language, had not dissolved. It had adapted, flowed around obstacles, found new channels. Empires would continue to rise and fall over the plateau. New conquerors would ride in from the steppes. Turkic warlords, Mongol khans, Timurid princes, all would claim Iran at some point. But when they did, they would inherit something older than their banners, a name, a language, and a story that had already survived one great fall and was not done yet. The next riders did not come from Arabia. They came from the steppe. If you had been living on the Iranian plateau in the centuries after Ferdowsi, you might have woken up one morning to hear that the army outside your city walls spoke a different language, wore different armor, prayed in the same direction, and carried the same book. Turkic-speaking soldiers had already been present in the region for a long time, as slaves, as mercenaries, as frontier warriors in both Abbasid and local Iranian armies. Over time, some of those soldiers did what ambitious men with weapons often do. They took over. One of the first great Turkic dynasties to rule large parts of the Iranian world was the Ghaznavids, based in Ghazni, in what's now Afghanistan. Their founder, Mahmud of Ghazni, is remembered in many ways, as a raider into India, as a builder of mosques and palaces, as a patron of scholars. He was ethnically Turkic, raised in a military household, operating in a thoroughly Islamic world. And yet, when he wanted to make his court feel like the center of civilization, he didn't turn to some new steppe tradition. He hired Persian poets. Ferdowsi himself brought his Shahnameh to Ghazni, hoping for reward. Other poets like Unsuri and Faraki flourished there. The court language, the language of praise and history, was Persian. The imagery was Iranian, kings of Iran, heroes of Iran, virtues defined by Iran's remembered past. This pattern would only deepen. After the Ghaznavids came the Seljuks, another Turkic dynasty who, in the 11th and 12th centuries, spilled across Iran, Iraq, and Anatolia like a slow-moving tide. On the battlefield, they looked different from earlier Iranian dynasts. Steppe cavalry, composite bows, tribal confederations following charismatic sultans. At the level of imagination, though, they stepped into an already furnished house. They adopted the title Sultan and recognized the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad as a source of religious legitimacy. In practice, their administration was staffed by Persian bureaucrats, their chancery documents written in Arabic and Persian, their cities governed by men steeped in Sassanid and early Islamic Iranian traditions. One of the most famous Seljuk viziers, Nizam al-Mulk, was himself a Persian from Tus, the same town as Ferdowsi. His manual of government, the Siyasat-Nameh, reads like a bridge between worlds. It quotes the Quran and Hadith, but it also invokes pre-Islamic Iranian kings as models of just rule. To many observers, it might have seemed that a new synthesis had formed. Turkic military power on top, Persian administrative brains underneath, Islamic faith tying it together. Then the sky fell. In the early 13th century, a new force began to move westward out of the eastern steppes. The Mongols, unified under a man the sources call Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan. By the time Mongol scouts appeared on the northeastern frontiers of the Iranian world, the region was already politically fragmented. Khwarezmian rulers held much of Iran and Central Asia, often clashing with neighboring polities. Trade routes were busy, cities wealthy, rivalries intense. The chain of events that brought Genghis Khan's fury down on Iran begins, in many accounts, with a caravan and a diplomatic incident. Merchants killed, envoys executed or humiliated. The details are debated, the outlines consistent. The Mongol leader took it as an unforgivable insult. What followed, between roughly 1219 and 1221, was one of the most devastating invasions Iran had ever seen. Mongol armies, moving with terrifying speed and coordination, descended on major cities: Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishabur, Herat, Merv, among others. Contemporary reports speak of slaughter on a scale that is hard to grasp: streets piled with bodies, irrigation systems destroyed, libraries burned, fields left untilled. Modern historians argue over exact numbers. Medieval chroniclers, writing in shock, often speak in absolutes. Entire populations wiped out, cities emptied. What almost everyone agrees on is that the demographic and economic toll was catastrophic. Some regions took generations to recover, others never fully did. For a moment, it might have seemed that not just dynasties, but culture itself had been broken, and yet something familiar began to happen. The Mongols who ruled the western part of the empire, the sector known as the Ilkhanate, with centers in Iran and neighboring lands, did not remain strangers forever. At first, the Ilkhans were explicitly Mongol rulers over a conquered, mostly Muslim population. They followed steppe law, consulted Mongol shamans and Buddhist and Christian advisors, and treated Iran as a source of revenue and pasturage. But governing a sophisticated, literate society requires more than horse archers. Gradually, the Ilkhanate rulers drew on the expertise around them. They hired Persian administrators to manage taxes, cities, and long-distance trade. They relied on local scholars to interpret Islamic law when it was convenient and to explain Iranian customs when it was useful. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Ilkhans themselves began to convert to Islam. Ghazan Khan, who ruled from 1295 to 1304, is especially famous for this turn. Under him and his successors, a consciously Islamic and increasingly Iran-centered court culture emerged. One of the key figures in this transformation was a man named Rashid al-Din Fazlullah, a Jewish-born physician who converted to Islam, rose to become vizier, and became one of the most important historians of the medieval world. Working at the Ilkhanid court, Rashid al-Din oversaw the production of the Jami al-Tawarikh, the Compendium of Chronicles. It was more than a history of the Mongols. It was an attempt to gather the histories of many peoples, Chinese, Indian, European, Iranian, into a single, illustrated, Persianate project. Think of what that means: A Mongol-ruled court in Iran commissioned a vast, visually rich universal history, written largely in Persian, integrating steppe traditions into an Iranian and Islamic narrative frame. The conquerors had not simply erased the culture they overran. They were being drawn into it, woven in, turned from a storm into another thread. Over time, the Ilkhanate fractured. Local dynasties rose. In the Eastern Iranian world and Central Asia, new powers appeared, some tracing their prestige to the Mongols, others to older Iranian or Turkic lines. Into this shifting landscape rode another conqueror, with steppe roots and Iranian ambitions. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur was a Turco-Mongol warlord from the region around Samarkand. He claimed to be restoring Mongol order, but his ruling style and his cultural choices tell a more complex story. On the battlefield, he was ruthless, leaving pyramids of skulls outside defiant cities, moving populations, breaking rivals. But in the cities he favored, Samarkand, and later Herat under his successors, he poured resources into art, architecture, and scholarship. The dynasty that grew out of his campaigns, the Timurids, ruled a patchwork of territories across Central Asia, eastern Iran, and parts of Afghanistan. Politically, their control wavered. Culturally, their impact was enormous. Under the Timurids, Persian art entered a new, highly refined phase. Workshops in Herat and Samarkand produced some of the most exquisite miniature paintings of the Islamic world. Richly colored, densely detailed illustrations of epics, romances, and histories. Calligraphers perfected scripts that turned the written word itself into ornament. Architects built tiled madrasas, mausoleums, and mosques that still define the skylines of those cities. The language of high culture in these courts was Persian. The stories they illustrated were often drawn from Iranian classics like the Shahnameh. Poets such as Jami wrote in Persian, drawing on the mystical legacies of earlier figures like Rumi and Hafez, whose ghazals had already woven love, longing, and metaphysical reflection into a uniquely Persian Islamic voice. Samarkand and Herat, geographically outside what we now think of as Iran's borders, functioned in many ways as Iranian cultural capitals. Their elite saw themselves as heirs to Iranian kingship, even if their genealogies ran through the steppe. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of these centuries. On maps, Iran could disappear, carved up among Ghaznavids, Seljuks, Khwarezmians, Mongol Ilkhans, Timurids, and countless local dynasts. In minds and manuscripts, it did not. Poets and historians continue to use words like Iran and Iranshah to describe a cultural and sometimes geographic whole, even if no single ruler commanded all of it. The line between Iran and neighboring lands like Turan or Hind might be fuzzy on the ground, but in epics and chronicles the idea remained coherent. A Turkic sultan could sit on a throne in Isfahan and commission a copy of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, with himself painted in the margin as a new kind of Iranian king. A Mongol-born Khan in Tabriz could order histories that placed the story of his people inside an Iranian and Islamic timeline. A Timurid prince in Herat could patronize scholars who wrote about past dynasties of Iran as if he were their natural successor. Conquerors came and went. They burned cities, rebuilt them, renamed them. Their own languages, Turkic, Mongol, left marks on the region. But for the business of ruling, of remembering, of imagining greatness, they nearly all reached for Persian. They entered an Iranian house and without quite meaning to began speaking its language. By the late 15th century, the steppe and the plateau were intimately entangled. Turkic tribal confederations roamed the borders of what we would now call Iran. Persianate cities glowed with learning. Sufi orders spread across the region, binding far-flung communities with shared rituals and saints. Underneath the shifting banners, a familiar question was beginning to stir. If so many foreign dynasties could wear Iranian culture like a robe, Could there be a dynasty that claimed the land itself, not just the priest? At its center was a shrine, a lineage of spiritual masters, and a growing circle of followers devoted to a saintly figure named Safi al-Din. For generations, the Safavid sheikhs preached, taught, and quietly gathered influence. Their disciples came from the surrounding Turkic-speaking tribes. Fiercely loyal, easily mobilized, they mixed mystical devotion with a taste for battle. Over time, those followers became known as the Qizilbash, redheads, for their distinctive red hats with 12 folds, each symbolizing one of the 12 Shia imams. Out of this blend of Sufi piety and tribal militancy, a boy was born in 1487, Ismail. By the time he was a teenager, his world had turned violent. Family members killed, the order persecuted, the young sheikh forced into hiding. He spent years moving between mountain fortresses and remote refuges, always guarded by Qizilbash warriors who believed he was more than just a leader. To many of them, he was a messianic figure, a chosen one who would overturn the old order. At the age of 13, Ismail came down from the mountains. The scene is easy to imagine, even if the details blur in the sources. A boy with burning eyes, banners snapping in the wind, tribal warriors swirling around him. His enemies, the local rulers who had tried to crush the Safavid order, underestimated him. They didn't make that mistake twice. In a string of battles at the turn of the 16th century, Ismail shattered rival forces in the northwest of the Iranian world. Towns opened their gates, tribal chiefs switched allegiance. Within a few years, the teenager from Ardebel had carved out a realm that stretched across Azerbaijan and into much of what we now think of as northern and western Iran. In 1501, he marched into Tabriz, one of the great cities of the region, and had himself crowned. That moment is often taken as the formal beginning of the Safavid dynasty. It was more than just another coronation. For the first time in centuries, a ruler based on the Iranian plateau would set out to weld most of its lands into a single, consciously defined political unit. Not just the domains of so-and-so sultan, not just the lands paying tax to such and such conqueror, but something closer to the old idea of Iran Shah made concrete again. Ismail I moved fast. Over the first decade and a half of his reign, his armies rolled east into Khorasan, south toward Fars, west into Iraq, north into the Caucasus. Victories alternated with bloody setbacks, especially against the rising Ottoman Empire to the west. But bit by bit, the mosaic of post-Timurid principalities on the plateau was hammered into something approaching unity. If you had looked at a map around 1520, you would have seen a shape beginning to emerge. It wouldn't match modern borders exactly, but it would be close enough to feel familiar. A political Iran was being reborn, and yet the Safavid project was not just about geography. Ismail made a decision that would define Iran's identity, right down to the present day. Up to this point, most of the Islamic world, including most of the Iranian plateau, had been Sunni. Shia communities existed, some quite influential, but they were minorities, scattered and often persecuted. The Safavid Sufi order, over generations, had moved closer and closer to Shi'ism, weaving veneration of the 12 imams into its devotion. Ismail took the final step. He declared 12er Shia Islam the official state-backed form of religion in his realm. This was not a gentle, gradual shift. It was abrupt, sometimes violent. Sunni scholars were pressured to convert, expelled, or in some cases killed. Public rituals changed. New prayers were recited in mosques. Sermons denounced Sunni caliphs whom earlier dynasties had praised. Shrines associated with the family of the Prophet received special honor. In cities and villages across the plateau, the religious landscape tilted. What had been one sect among many was now the official orthodoxy of a kingdom that called itself heir to Iran's past. At the same time, to the west, the Ottoman Empire was consolidating its own Sunni identity. Between them, a line began to harden, not just of armies and fortresses, but of doctrine and memory. Iran, under the Safavids, was becoming Shia in a way that would mark it off permanently from most of its neighbors. The process took generations. In some regions, local customs resisted for a long time. In others, devotion to the imams found easy soil. Over the 16th and 17th centuries, imported scholars from places like Lebanon and Iraq helped systematize Shia lore and theology in the Safavid realms, teaching, debating, writing books that would become foundations of Iranian religious life. By the time the dust settled, Iran was something new, a Shia majority, Persian-speaking imperial state, ringed by mostly Sunni powers. Religion was only one part of the Safavid story. To feel what their Iran was like at its height, you have to walk, slowly, in your mind, through the city that became their greatest stage, Isfahan. Under Shah Abbas the Great, who came to the throne in the late 16th century, the Safavid state reached its political and cultural peak. Abbas shifted the capital to Isfahan and set about turning it into a masterpiece. Imagine entering the Great Square, Naqsh-i-Jahan, image of the world. On one side, the Shah Mosque, its dome a sea of blue tiles catching the light. On another, the Sheikh Lotfullah Mosque, more intimate, its interior patterned like the inside of a seashell. Along the edges, bazaars spill out, carpets, silks, spices, books, calligraphy. Bridges with elegant arches stretch over the Zayanda River, creating spaces where poets recite verses and merchants talk in many languages. Armenian Christians in the suburb of New Ulfa maintain their churches and trade networks. Indian, Ottoman, Phoenician, and Portuguese merchants haggle in caravanserais. Workshops produce intricate metalwork, ceramics, and miniatures that travel far beyond Iran. To many visitors, Isfahan felt like a world in itself. There's a reason later Persians would call it Nesfe Jahan, half the world. In the chancery offices behind those glittering facades, something else was happening, quieter but just as important for our story. Safavid rulers and bureaucrats were thinking and writing about their state as Iran. In their letters, treaties, and internal documents, terms like Mamlek-i-Iran, the domains of Iran, and Mulk-i-Iran, the realm of Iran, appear, alongside older, more familiar names like Persia, Fars, and region-specific titles. They drew on Sassanid memories, Islamic-era chronicles, and epic literature to frame their kingdom as the latest incarnation of an ancient Iranian polity. In other words, they weren't just ruling territory. They were reviving an idea. Inside the country, Iran had a clear resonance, geographic, cultural, historical. But outside, the old pattern held. European diplomats, merchants, and mapmakers continued to talk about Persia. They met the Persian king, traded for Persian carpets, wrote home about Persian court ceremonials. Latin, Italian, French, and later English text used the classical name that went back to the Achaemenids and the Greek historians. Sometimes, Safavid court letters sent to Europe would be translated and labeled with Persia in the margins, even if the original Persian text spoke of Iran. Two names, overlapping. Inside the house, people knew they were in Iran. Outside, visitors kept calling it Persia. This dual identity hardened during the Safavid centuries. Iran in Persian became the language of self-understanding, of history and poetry and law. Persia, in European tongues, became the label that circulated on maps and in encyclopedias. By the time the Safavid dynasty began to weaken in the 18th century, the pattern was deeply set. An Iranian could say, "We are the people of Iran," and a European could reply, "Ah, yes, the Persians, and both would more or less be talking about the same place. Which brings us back to the puzzle at the heart of our story. If Iranians, under the Safavids and after, were already thinking of their land as Iran, if their kings used the word in official scripts, if their poets and scholars wove it into their works, what then finally persuaded the outside world to stop saying Persia and start saying Iran? Who asked? Who agreed? And why did it matter so much in the 20th century, when the land itself and the memories that shaped it were already thousands of years old? To answer that, we have to watch Iran pass through another age of fragility and reform, through Qajar weakness, foreign pressure, and the ambitions of a new kind of ruler who wanted not only to control Iran, but to rename it in the eyes of the world. By the 19th century, that Safavid world of Isfahan's shining domes and confident Mulk-e-Iran was gone. In its place stood a dynasty that always seemed to be arriving a little too late, the Qajars. They came to power in the late 1700s, after decades of chaos, civil war, and invasion. In one sense, they did something important. They pulled the fractured lands of Iran back into a single kingdom. But they inherited a world that had changed around them. Europe wasn't sending a handful of merchants and envoys anymore. It was sending empires. To the north, the Russian Empire was pushing steadily southward through the Caucasus. To the south and east, the British Empire, rooted in India, was creeping closer through diplomacy, trade, and, when needed, gunboats. Iran, sitting in between, became less a great kingdom in its own right, and more a contested buffer. The Qajar court in Tehran tried to play the game, but it was always outmatched. In the early 1800s, Iran fought two disastrous wars with Russia. They ended with two harsh treaties, Gulistan in 1813 and Turkmenchay in 1828. On paper, these were just diplomatic agreements. In reality, they were amputations. Iran lost almost all of its Caucasian territories, Georgia, much of present-day Azerbaijan, parts of Armenia and Dagestan. Lands that had been tied into the Iranian cultural and political sphere for centuries were now gone, absorbed into the Russian Empire. For many Iranians, this was more than a military defeat. It was a humiliation that lingered in memory, a sign that the old balance of power had vanished. Meanwhile, Britain was nibbling at Iran's edges from the Persian Gulf and from India, securing trade privileges, influencing court politics, pressing for concessions. When the Qajars needed money, they turned to foreign loans. Those loans came with strings attached: control over customs revenues, monopolies over tobacco, oil, and other resources. Inside the country, resentment simmered. You can imagine the mood in Tehran's bazaars and provincial towns. Clerics, merchants, clerks, minor notables, watching foreign advisors walk in and out of ministries, hearing about another concession, another tax, another humiliation. The word Iran still lived in poetry and prayer, but the reality of Iran felt smaller, more constrained. In 1890, a royal concession gave a British company control over the entire tobacco trade. For many people, it was one insult too many. The reaction was unexpected: a broad, coordinated boycott. Tobacco sellers shut their shops. People stopped smoking in public. Religious leaders issued rulings declaring tobacco use forbidden until the concession was cancelled. The Shah eventually backed down. It was a glimpse of something new, a population discovering its political voice. That voice grew louder a decade later. In 1905, anger over foreign influence, government corruption, and economic hardship sparked protests that would grow into the constitutional revolution. Merchants took sanctuary in mosques. Clerics gave fiery sermons. Students and intellectuals circulated pamphlets. Crowds demanded not just a change in policy, but a change in the rules themselves. They wanted a written constitution, a parliament, limits on royal power. By 1906, under intense pressure, The Qajar Shah agreed to create a majlis, a national assembly, and to accept a constitution. For the first time, modern political language entered Iranian public life. Nation, law, rights. Newspapers debated the future of Millet-e Iran, the Iranian nation. The revolution was messy. It faced internal divisions, royalist backlash, and foreign intervention. At times, the Males was shelled, its supporters exiled or killed. But something fundamental had shifted. Iran was no longer just a king's domain. More and more people were beginning to think of it as a nation that ought to govern itself. Out of this turbulence, a new kind of figure stepped onto the stage, a military strongman with a vision of national salvation. His name was Reza Khan. In February 1921, as Britain and Russia reeled from war and revolution, Reza Khan led a column of Cossack brigade troops into Tehran. The coup was relatively bloodless but decisive. Within days, he controlled the capital. At first, he ruled behind the scenes as the real power behind a weak Qajar Shah, but his ambitions were larger than being a mere commander. He took the post of war minister, then prime minister. In 1925, with the backing of many deputies in the Majlis, tired of Qajar weakness, intrigued by his promise of order, Reza Khan deposed the last Qajar Shah and crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi. The dynasty changed. So did the tempo of reform. Reza Shah looked westward, especially at one example, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's Turkey. Just across the border, another former imperial land was being rapidly secularized, centralized, and rebranded as a modern nation-state. Reza Shah wanted something similar for Iran. He pushed through a whirlwind of modernization measures. The state built railroads, including the great north-south Trans-Iranian Railway, linking the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. Roads and telegraphs knit the country together in ways that earlier dynasties could only imagine. Secular schools expanded. New universities were founded. The legal system was reshaped, with European-style civil codes and courts limiting the role of traditional religious law in many areas. The army was reorganized, conscription introduced, uniforms standardized. Even clothing became political. In the 1930s, Reza Shah's government encouraged, then enforced, changes in dress. Men were pushed to abandon traditional robes and turbans for Western-style suits and hats. Women were pressured to unveil. In some cases, the veil was explicitly banned in public spaces. For some urban families, this felt like liberation. For others, it was a shocking intrusion into private and religious life. Beneath all of this, there was another project at work, a deliberate revival of pre-Islamic Iranian identity. State historians, archaeologists, and artists were encouraged to celebrate the Achaemenids, the Sassanids, and the ancient idea of Iran Shah. Persepolis was cleared and restored. Schoolbooks praised Cyrus the Great and Darius. The very name, Pahlavi, that Reza Shah chose for his dynasty, echoed the term Pahlavi used for Middle Persian, the language of the Sassanid era. The message was clear. Iran was not just an Islamic kingdom. It was the heir to a much older, grander civilization. Inside the country, Iran had long been a familiar word. Now the state was wrapping it in marble and myth, turning it into a modern brand. Outside, though, most of the world still said Persia. In 1935, Reza Shah decided to change that. That year, he sent a formal request to foreign governments and international organizations. In their official correspondence and dealings, they should stop calling his country Persia and instead use Iran. The argument he and his advisors advanced was straightforward. Iran, they said, was the country's true ancient name, the one found in old inscriptions, epic poetry, and native usage. Persia was a Greek-Latin exonym derived from Pars, one province among many. frozen in time by centuries of Western habit. If Iranians themselves called their land Iran, why shouldn't everyone else? The request was largely honored. Diplomatic cables, treaties, and maps began to switch terminology. In English, French, Russian, and other languages, Iran moved from the margins to the center. But the story doesn't end with a neat act of national self-assertion. It gets more complicated. Historians and commentators have long debated what else might have been in the air in 1935. One line of speculation points to the global climate of the 1930s, when Nazi Germany was loudly promoting ideas of Aryan racial identity. The word Iran is etymologically connected to Aryan, both going back to an old Indo-Iranian term that, in ancient contexts, referred to noble or free peoples. Some German scholars and ideologues of the time took a keen, if distorted, interest in this connection. Were German advisors or diplomats in Tehran encouraging Reza Shah to emphasize Iran over Persia as part of a shared Aryan narrative? Did he see some propaganda advantage, or a way to align himself with what looked, at that moment, like a rising European power? Different sources hint in different directions. Some accounts suggest German influence played a role, at least in reinforcing the decision. Others argue the move was primarily homegrown, rooted in decades of Iranian nationalist thought, from the constitutional revolution onward, and in Reza Shah's own preoccupation with pre-Islamic glory. The truth may be a mixture. There's no single document that settles the matter beyond dispute. What we can say is that after 1935, the outside world's mental map shifted. Iran started appearing where Persia had once been printed by reflex. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some Iranian intellectuals, especially those with strong cultural ties to the West, felt that Persia carried a poetic, artistic resonance that Iran lacked in European languages. Persian evoked carpets, miniature paintings, poetry, and a certain romantic aura that had built up over centuries of travelogues and Orientalist fantasies. Iran, to foreign ears, sounded unfamiliar, even harsh. Members of the diaspora who had grown up being called Persian wondered what this meant for their identity. Inside the country, a few critics worried that the tightly managed cult of ancient Iran might sideline other layers of the country's past, particularly its Islamic and regional diversity. Over time, the issue went quiet, but it never disappeared entirely. In 1959, Reza Shah's son and successor, Mohammad Reza Shah, tried to smooth the edges. He announced that, in foreign languages, both Iran and Persia were acceptable names for the country. It was a gesture of flexibility, an attempt to acknowledge nostalgia and habit. But history is sticky. By then, international institutions, diplomatic styles, and maps had largely settled on Iran. The name had taken root, and so, in a sense, the circle closed. A word that had traveled from the epics of Ferdowsi and the inscriptions of Sassanid kings, through Safavid chancelleries and Qajar debates, finally stepped fully into the global spotlight. Not because the land had changed overnight, but because a modern state, in a moment of anxiety and ambition, insisted that the world call it by the name it had been whispering to itself all along. Persia did not vanish. It survived in language, Persian carpets, Persian cats, Persian literature, and in the way many Iranians still describe their culture abroad. But on passports, at the United Nations, in the headlines that roll across screens in the night, the word that appears is the older one, reborn, Iran. What really happened was quieter and stranger. A name that had been there from the beginning, buried in epic poetry, carved in stone by Sassanid kings, murmured in village prayers and courtly letters, finally rose to the surface of the world's maps. Iran didn't arrive, it resurfaced. For more than 2,500 years, outsiders had learned to see this land through one narrow window. Persia, the realm of one province, one people, one chapter of a much longer book. But underneath that label, the older word never went away. Iran, Iran Shah, the land of the Iranians. Empires rose and fell on that plateau. Medes, Achaemenids, Seleucids, Parthians, Sassanians, Arab caliphates, Turkish sultanates, Mongol Khanates, Timurid courts, Safavid Shahs, Qajar princes, Pahlavi reformers. Each came with its own banners, its own titles, its own dreams of order. Each, in its own way, tried to reshape what Iran meant. And yet, across all of those upheavals, something held. Languages shifted, religions changed, frontiers moved like the edges of a tide pool. But the idea of an Iranian world, of a shared history, a shared literary memory, a certain way of weaving poetry and politics together, survived conquest, conversion, and reinvention. You can see that continuity in strange little places. In the way a Safavid bureaucrat still reached for Sassanid-flavored words to describe his king. In the way a Qajar poet could quote Ferdowsi and expect every listener in the coffee house to nod along. In the way a modern schoolchild opening a textbook in Tehran might see Cyrus and Imam Ali, Persepolis and Karbala, printed on adjacent pages as if they had always belonged to the same story. Today, that double life of names continues. Persia lingers in the corners of everyday speech. Persian rugs spread across living rooms far from Isfahan. Persian cats curl on windowsills. Persian miniatures hang in quiet museum halls. The Persian Gulf still glitters on maps and in satellite images, its name carrying centuries of argument and pride. And Iran stands on the world stage, on passports, at embassies, in news tickers sliding across screens in the dark. The word that once echoed from ancient rock reliefs now lives in microphones and digital files, spoken in dozens of accents, heard in 1,000 different ways. Maybe that's the real lesson of this long journey. Names change, but identities are layered, not replaced. A country can be Persia and Iran at the same time, depending on who is speaking, and when, and why. Just as each of us carries older versions of ourselves inside the person the world sees today. If this quiet walk through millennia kept you company tonight, if you found yourself drifting with the Medes, the Achaemenids, the Caliphs, the Shahs, take a moment before sleep pulls you under to tap like, to subscribe, and to leave a comment. Tell us where you're listening from, which corner of the world you're lying in now, while you imagine caravans crossing the plateau under a different sky. And if your mind is still wandering further back to bottlenecks, vanished ancestors, and the deep prehistory of our species, you can explore those secrets in more detail in the book, waiting at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, let the names blur together. Persia, Iran, Iran Shah. Empires dissolving into dust. Arguments over maps fading into whispers. Dynasties shrinking to a few lines of print. What remains is a stretch of earth, a mesh of stories, and the quiet knowledge that identities, like rivers, keep flowing even when their surface seems to change. Let that thought rest with you, that beneath the headlines and the arguments, beneath the labels and the borders, there are older currents moving slowly through time. And as you close your eyes, you can let yourself drift with them, gently, into sleep.